The rooftop was almost empty, for overhead lights still burning out of 9. The dead ones sat in their housings like closed eyes, carving the upper level of the parking structure into zones, the lit, and the deliberately not. Seoul glittered beyond the concrete railing in its usual indifference, 40 floors of light that had nothing to do with her. Joy had stopped expecting the city to care about her approximately 6 months ago, somewhere between the third blacklisted project and the moment she realized her professional references were being quietly, systematically poisoned. Her boots hit the rooftop asphalt. She was not running. She knew better than to run. Running looked like guilt in Min-jun's vocabulary, and Min-jun had a very specific vocabulary for everything she did wrong. She walked fast, which she had told herself was different, though her body seemed to have stopped believing the distinction somewhere around the second parking level. Her breath came in shallow pulls. The cold pressed into her lungs like a warning she hadn't asked for. She did not look back. Looking back was the mechanism. She had mapped it by now with the same methodical attention she brought to blueprints, the sequence of how it worked, the structural logic of it. You turned around and his face would be doing the thing. The stillness. The mild, bewildered hurt of a man who could not understand why the woman he'd chosen kept misreading his attention as threat. And your own mind would begin the work before he had to. You're overreacting. He's never actually touched you. He just wants to talk. 11 months of that architecture. 11 months of a cage built not from walls but from her own second-guessing. Not tonight. Her boots hit the asphalt. The wind off the Han River found every gap in her coat. Behind her, not running, never running, she could hear the unhurried rhythm of Min-jun's footsteps on the ramp. He had come up from the lower level in his own time, the way a man moves through a space he believes belongs to him by right. And in a city like this, with a family like his, it more or less did. He hadn't needed to chase her. He'd needed to simply arrive, and the geometry of this rooftop would do the rest. She had thought about this. She had done what she always did when the fear became too loud, she turned it into a problem with dimensions. The stairwell door she'd come through, locked from the inside now, she'd heard it click. The elevator bank, she could see the indicator light frozen on B2, called down by someone, and Min-jun's driver was almost certainly in that lobby. The ramp she'd come up, that was Min-jun's direction. The emergency exit on the north wall, chained. She had noticed it on her first day in this building, the way she noticed all exits, the way you learn to notice exits when home stops feeling like one. The railing beyond the north wall was open air and a 40-story drop. She had, in 11 months, become very good at counting the ways out of a room and arriving at 0. She had a type, apparently. Not in the way people meant when they said it, raised eyebrow, knowing smile. Joy's type was this, men who made her feel like a problem to be managed. She had spent 11 months telling herself that Min-jun was an anomaly. A cultural misread. A professional complication she could think her way out of, if she just approached it correctly. She was on a rooftop in Gangnam at midnight with no exits and his footsteps behind her. Clearly, the thinking approach needed revision. Then she saw him. He was standing apart from the rooftop's 2 remaining vehicles, leaning against the side of a black SUV that absorbed the overhead light rather than reflecting it. He was smoking, not nervously, not socially, the way a man smokes when he is alone with a thought he hasn't finished yet. His coat was dark wool, the collar turned up against the wind. Even at this distance she could see the tattoo on his neck, the sharp edge of a tattoo curling above the fabric like a border marker on a territory she had no map for. He was looking at the city the way she imagined a person looks at something they own. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what kind of man stood alone on a rooftop in this neighborhood at this hour and looked like he was exactly where he meant to be. Behind her, Min-jun's footsteps slowed. He had seen her stop. He was waiting to see what she would do, because that was the other mechanism. Making her feel like every move was her choice, her mistake, her fault. She heard him exhale. Unhurried. Certain. Joy Peter had a doctorate in architectural history. She had spent 12 years reading the bones of buildings, the logic underneath the surface, the intention buried in the structure. She understood, better than most, that a trap was only a trap if you accepted its original geometry. She stopped accepting it. She moved. Not toward the exit. Not toward the railing. Toward the man with the tattoo on his neck and the city in his eyes, who was still smoking his cigarette and had not yet looked at her, until she closed the last 3 meters at something between a walk and a controlled fall, grabbed the lapel of his wool coat with both hands, pressed her face against the warmth of his chest, and said the thing she had never in her life said to any stranger, in any country, in any language. Please. Just pretend to be my husband. His body went absolutely still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of a predator who has just decided whether or not to move. Heart pounding yet? If this rooftop gamble has you on edge, hit that subscribe button now, you won't want to miss Yuxuan's next move. Share with a friend who loves K-drama twists, and thank you for jumping in. Behind her, she heard Min-jun's footsteps stop. Later, she would understand that she hadn't chosen him. She had recognized him. The way you recognize a locked door, only after you've already put your hand on it. The next 5 seconds were going to determine the rest of her life. She just didn't know yet that the man whose coat she was clutching had already made the same calculation, and arrived at a very different answer than the one she was hoping for. 3 months earlier, Joy had arrived in Seoul with 2 suitcases, a research grant from Northwestern, and the particular confidence of a woman who had survived Chicago winters and a dissertation committee in the same calendar year. She had not survived Min-jun Lee yet. That education was still coming. He hadn't moved. That was the first thing Joy registered. She had thrown herself at a stranger, whispered something that could only be described as unhinged, and he hadn't moved a single centimeter. No flinch. No step back. Just that absolute stillness, like a building that had already decided it wasn't going anywhere. Then his hand settled on her waist. Not gently. Not romantically. The way you place a hand on something you've just decided is yours. She heard Min-jun's footsteps resume, slower now, deliberate. She could feel him smiling without turning around. That particular smile. The one that meant he'd already written the ending. Joy. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. Who is this? The man holding her didn't answer immediately. She felt him look up. Felt the shift in the air the way you feel a pressure change before a storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. That specific kind of quiet that doesn't need volume because the room has already decided to listen. You are harassing my wife. 3 words that rewrote the geometry of the entire rooftop. Min-jun laughed, short, sharp, the sound of a man who hadn't been surprised in years. Your wife. He tried the words like he was tasting something off. She didn't mention a husband. No. A pause. She wouldn't. She's considerate that way. His thumb moved once against Joy's side, barely anything, a ghost of pressure. Unlike you, Shin Min-jun, who has been considerably less considerate with the 430 million won he owes the 7-star syndicate. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. Joy felt Min-jun stop breathing before she heard him stop moving. When she finally turned, because she had to, because she needed to see it, his face had done something she had never once witnessed in 11 months. It had gone afraid. He left without another word. No exit line. No pleasant smile. Just the sound of expensive shoes moving very quickly toward the elevator, and then nothing. The SUV door closed behind her like a verdict. She hadn't exactly agreed to get in. But she hadn't exactly been asked. The city moved past the tinted glass in silence. Yuxuan sat beside her, not looking at her, his forearm resting on the door. The tattoos she'd seen from across the rooftop continued beneath his sleeve, she could see the edge of them at his wrist. Korean script she couldn't read. You humiliated the son of the Shin family, he said finally. You humiliated him. You started it. He turned then, And she understood for the first time what she'd actually grabbed onto in that parking lot. Now it has to be finished properly. You'll stay in my residence until the situation is managed. You'll do what I tell you, when I tell you. Joy stared at him. That's not protection. That's a different cage. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Yes, he said. But this one has better locks. The car continued toward Hannam-dong. She knew what the building was before she was fully out of the car. That was the thing about studying structures for 12 years, you stopped seeing architecture as decoration and started reading it as intention. The estate in Hannam-dong didn't announce itself the way wealth usually did in this city. No ornamental gates. No landscaping designed to impress. Just a high concrete perimeter wall, smooth and unbroken, the kind of surface that offered nothing to climb and nothing to read. The entrance was a single vehicle gate, steel cord beneath its matte finish. One way in. Joy counted 2 external cameras before she reached the front door. She suspected there were 6 more she hadn't seen. Not a home, she thought. A position. Inside was quieter than she expected. The ceilings were high, the materials brutally honest, raw concrete, dark steel, glass that was thicker than standard and slightly tinted. Beautiful, in the way that a well-designed lock was beautiful. Every choice in this building was load-bearing. Nothing existed for comfort. Everything existed to hold. She stood in the entrance hall and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had just run out of options, that she had traded one trap for a significantly more expensive one. Yuxuan reappeared from a room off the main corridor. He set a folder on the table between them without ceremony. Civil union documentation, he said. Backdated. My legal team prepared it this evening. Joy looked at the folder without touching it. This evening. I have efficient legal teams. She opened it. The Korean was dense, formal register, the kind used in contracts and courtrooms. Her reading comprehension handled daily life comfortably. This was several floors above daily life. It legitimizes our arrangement for any investigator Min-jun hires, Yuxuan continued. It also provides a degree of legal insulation for my current situation with the authorities. A domestic partner on record creates certain complications for surveillance applications. He said it the way someone describes weather. Factual. Untroubled. It's temporary. Sign at the marked sections. She should have asked for a translation. She understood that, even as she picked up the pen. But she was tired in the specific way that follows terror, hollowed out and running on the embers of adrenaline, and the document looked like what he'd described, and she had nowhere else to go. She signed. Yuxuan collected the folder without looking at it. Something moved across his expression, there and gone, too fast to name. Her room was on the 3rd floor. Separate from his, she noted. She noted it the way you note an unexpected kindness from someone you don't trust. The bed was made. There were toiletries arranged in the bathroom, unopened, her approximate preferences somehow correct. A glass of water on the nightstand. Yuxuan stood in the doorway exactly long enough to confirm she had everything she needed. Then he left without saying goodnight. Joy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the walls. Concrete. Solid. No give whatsoever. She had signed something she couldn't fully read, in a language she didn't entirely know, in a house designed to keep things in as effectively as it kept things out. 12 years reading buildings, she thought. And you walked right into this one. She learned his patterns before she learned anything else about him. 4 days of cohabitation taught her this. Yuxuan was awake before dawn. He took his coffee without anything in it, standing at the kitchen counter, not sitting, like sitting was a concession he hadn't decided to make yet. He read physical documents, never a screen. He moved through the house in a way that suggested he had already mapped every room for exits and threats before she'd ever arrived, and found them all satisfactory. He did not make small talk. He did not explain himself. He left space in conversations the way the building left space in its design, not emptiness, but intention. She found him on the third morning in the study, jacket off, working through documents at the desk. The tattoos covered more than she'd realized, both arms to the wrist, the tattoo continuing across his shoulders and up his neck in patterns she didn't have the cultural vocabulary to decode yet. He didn't acknowledge her presence. Didn't reach for the jacket. She understood it wasn't carelessness. It was assessment. He was seeing whether she'd make it strange. She got her coffee and sat in the chair by the far wall and read her own documents. After 20 minutes he said, without looking up, "You're too loud." Joy looked around the silent room. "I haven't said anything." "That's not what I mean." He set down his pen. "Your face announces everything you think. In my world, that's an invitation." He studied her with the same attention he gave his documents. "You need nunchi." She knew the word. The art of reading a room, of sensing the emotional undercurrent beneath what was being said, responding to what was real rather than what was performed. "I have nunchi," she said. "American nunchi," he replied. Which, his tone suggested, was a different thing entirely. The tailor shop in Hannam-dong was the kind of establishment that had no sign outside and required an introduction to enter. Yuxuan moved through it like a man who had never needed an introduction to anything. They were being measured for the gala when Joy saw Min-jun's car through the shop's front glass. Parked across the street. Not subtle. Designed to be seen, a reminder that his retreat from the rooftop had been tactical, not final. She felt her shoulders tighten. Yuxuan stepped between her and the glass in a movement so seamless it could have been accidental. It wasn't. He said something quietly to the tailor in dialect she couldn't follow, and the measuring continued, and Min-jun's car eventually pulled away. He didn't mention it. Neither did she. But she stood close enough to feel the warmth through his sleeve, and he didn't move away, and the tailor's measuring tape pulled the moment taut between them like a thread neither of them acknowledged and neither of them broke. Later, walking back to the car, it occurred to Joy that she had not once checked the exits in that room. She'd only checked where he was. The ballroom understood power the way the estate did, through restraint. No excess. No noise. Just space, and light, and the particular silence of rooms where significant things had been decided and never spoken aloud. Joy had worn black at Yuxuan's instruction. Not red, he'd said, without explaining why. She'd worn black, and the tailor had done something to the cut that made her feel less like she was dressed and more like she was armored. She felt the room register their entrance before she saw it happen. A shift in the quality of attention. The 7-star elders, seated at a long table at the far end, men whose age and stillness suggested they had outlasted several versions of Seoul, watched Yuxuan move through the room and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand meant approval. Yuxuan's hand rested at the small of her back. She was learning to read his touch the way she read buildings, for structure, not decoration. Haewon found them at the midpoint of the evening. She was beautiful in the specific way of women who have weaponized it through long practice, every element of her appearance tuned to a frequency designed to make other women feel approximate. She addressed Joy in Korean so elevated it bordered on archaic, the kind of register that assumed incomprehension and performed graciousness in the assuming. "Your wife is very striking," she said to Yuxuan, not to Joy. "It must be freeing, I think is the word, to be so unaware of one's surroundings. Foreigners carry that lightness. It's almost charming." The elder nearest them watched without expression. Joy felt the shape of it clearly, the load-bearing insult disguised as compliment, the exclusion dressed as welcome. Haewon had built something in the middle of this ballroom, the way an architect places a wall. Decorative on the surface. Structural underneath. So Joy did what she did with every structure she didn't trust. She found the weak joint. "You're very generous," Joy replied in Korean, careful, correct, unhurried. "Though I think what reads as unawareness is sometimes just patience. The most important features of a room aren't always the ones demanding attention." She let a brief pause do its work. Any historian knows, the elements that announce themselves loudest are rarely the ones holding anything up. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Haewon's smile stayed exactly where it was. Nothing else did. The elder at the end of the table made a sound that might have been approval, and turned back to his drink, and the moment closed. Yuxuan took her hand 20 minutes later. Not at the table. Not in front of the elders or in view of the room. In a quiet corridor off the main hall, walking back from the terrace, when there was no audience and no reason. His fingers closed around hers without explanation. She didn't ask for one. They stood there for a moment, the city visible through the glass at the corridor's end, Seoul doing what it always did, glittering without caring, and Joy became aware, with the slow certainty of something she'd been reading in the walls for weeks, that she was in serious trouble. Not the rooftop kind. The other kind. You've stayed with us this far through the gala fire, thank you for that. Joy's reading the room like a pro now. Like this story if you're obsessed, subscribe for more Mafia heat, and share to spread the soul magic. It happened on a Tuesday. Joy had learned that danger in this world rarely announced itself, it arrived in the ordinary gaps, the unremarkable moments between one careful thing and the next. She was in the back of one of Yuxuan's cars, returning from the university library where she'd been permitted 2 hours of research under escort, when the motorcycle appeared in the wing mirror. Then the window beside her head became a spiderweb of fractured glass and the driver was already moving, already accelerating, already speaking into an earpiece in clipped Korean she felt rather than heard. It was over in 40 seconds. She sat in the stillness afterward with her hands flat on her thighs and counted her own breathing the way Yuxuan had taught her to count a room. Assess. Don't perform. Know what is actually true. What was actually true, she was unhurt. The glass had held. 2 of Yuxuan's men had materialized from somewhere and the motorcycle was gone. What was also true, someone had decided she was worth killing. Yuxuan was waiting when she got back. She knew immediately from the quality of his stillness that he already knew, not just about the incident, but about its origin. He stood in the entrance hall with his hands in his pockets and looked at her the way he looked at problems he'd already solved and didn't enjoy the solution to. You're leaving the estate less, he said. That's not a conversation about what just happened. It's the only conversation that matters. She set her bag down. Yuxuan. This was a contract. His voice was even. Distant in the specific way she recognized now, not coldness, but the performance of it. The armor going back on, piece by piece, in front of her. A practical arrangement. Nothing more. I'd prefer you remember that. The corridor held the words for a moment. That's interesting, Joy said quietly. Because I was in that corridor at the gala too. And I know what I felt. And I know you felt it. What you felt was proximity and adrenaline. What I felt, she said, was you choosing to hold my hand when no one was watching. He said nothing. You don't scare me, she added. Not like that. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he rarely let himself, and then walked away without answering, which she was learning was different from conceding nothing. Across the city, in a private room above a restaurant in Mapo, Min-jun slid an envelope across a table. The man across from him didn't open it. He didn't need to. The amount had been agreed upon already, in a previous meeting, in a different room, with the particular efficiency of men who had been waiting for an opportunity and recognized it when it arrived. Lieutenant Kong had served the 7-star syndicate for 11 years. He knew its architecture better than almost anyone, every entrance, every weakness, every name that mattered. He pocketed the envelope. When? Min-jun asked. Kong reached for his drink. When he's already looking somewhere else. Outside, Seoul moved through its Tuesday without knowing anything had changed. Something had. Confinement, Joy had discovered, was bearable if you gave it a problem to solve. She'd spent 3 days inside the estate following the incident, Yuxuan's instruction, delivered without discussion. The library on the 2nd floor became her territory by default. It was the room that felt least like a holding cell, mostly because it was full of things that required attention, and attention was the only currency she had left. She wasn't looking for anything. That was the honest version. She was reading the building the way she read all buildings, out of habit, out of the particular restlessness of a mind that couldn't stop asking what a structure was for. The estate had been commissioned in the late 80s, she'd established that much from the material composition of the walls. Brutalist residential. Relatively rare in Seoul. Which meant there was an architect with a name, and a name meant records. She found them on the fourth day, misfiled behind a row of legal volumes on the lowest shelf, original construction drawings, folded into a dull cardboard sleeve, the kind of storage that suggested someone had kept them without knowing why. She knew why within 20 minutes of spreading them across the reading table. The modern security schematics, which she'd seen Yuxuan's team reference during a briefing she wasn't meant to be near, showed the estate as a closed system. One entrance. Monitored perimeter. No structural surprises. The original plans showed something else entirely. A room behind the east interior wall, accessible through a panel in the library's fireplace surround, poured concrete construction, ventilated, roughly 4 meters square. And from its northern face, a passage. Narrow, descending at a gradual grade, running beneath the garden and the perimeter wall and continuing, she traced it with her finger, to an exit point near the riverbank. 140 meters. Unmonitored. Invisible on every current schematic because no current schematic had been drawn from the original plans. Whoever had updated this building's security had worked from the renovation drawings. The renovation drawings were incomplete. Joy sat back in her chair and held the knowledge the way you hold something fragile, carefully, aware of its weight. She went to find Yuxuan. His study door was open, which was unusual. She understood why when she reached the threshold, he wasn't there, called away suddenly by the sound of raised voices she could still hear from the floor below. The desk was mid-meeting. Documents spread. His safe on the far wall stood open. She should have waited in the corridor. The translation she'd requested weeks ago, of the documents she'd signed, sat in a neat folder on the desk's edge. Prepared by someone on his team. Left here in the disorder of a sudden departure. She read it in 4 minutes. Asset transfer deeds. Full marriage license. Legal title to 17 properties. Primary account authority for 6 holding companies. Her name. Her signature. Her handwriting, made into the foundation of an empire she hadn't known existed. Human shield, she thought. The phrase arrived without drama, without the mercy of ambiguity. She closed the folder. Set it back exactly where she'd found it. Walked to the window and looked at the perimeter wall, high, smooth, unreadable, and understood that she had spent weeks learning to read this building while it had been reading her all along. The tunnel in the library was the only exit she hadn't been given. Which meant it was the only one that was actually hers. The rain started at 10. Joy had learned to read the estate's sounds the way she read its structure, what was normal, what was load-bearing, what was absence dressed as presence. So when the perimeter alarm cycled off at 10:43 and didn't cycle back on, she knew before the first set of footsteps reached the ground floor. Not a fault. A removal. She was already moving. The library fireplace surround opened exactly as the original plans had indicated, a panel flush with the stone surround, released by pressing the third corbel from the left with sustained pressure. It swung inward on a pivot mechanism so well balanced it made no sound at all. 12 seconds after the first window broke downstairs, Joy was inside the wall. The passage was narrow and absolute dark and smelled of concrete and river damp and 80 years of disuse. She moved through it with one hand on each wall, counting her steps, holding the original dimensions in her mind like a map she'd memorized because she had, 3 days ago, alone in the library, because she was the kind of woman who prepared for the exits she hoped she'd never need. Behind her, through the walls, she could hear them moving through the house. She did not run. Running was how you miscounted. Yuxuan had been 20 minutes outside the city when he understood. The call from his second disturbance reported at the Mapo warehouse had arrived too cleanly. Too timed. He'd been moving toward it before the shape of it resolved, and when it did he was already turning the car around, already on the phone, already receiving the confirmation he'd feared. The estate's internal communications had gone silent. Kong. He said the name the way you say the name of a thing you should have seen sooner. He came through the perimeter on foot, from the riverbank side, because the front entrance would be watched and he hadn't survived this long by using the obvious door. He moved through his own garden like a man who no longer owned it, taking the ground-level opposition with a efficiency that left no noise and no question. The house was lit and wrong. He reached the east wall and found the panel already open. She heard him before she saw him, the specific cadence of someone who moved like he'd already decided the outcome. Joy. One word. The most stripped-down version of relief she'd ever heard from a human voice. She reached through the dark and found his sleeve and pulled him into the passage, and the panel swung shut behind them, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of rain through the walls and both of them breathing. The papers, she said. Not are you hurt? Not I was afraid. Because she had been living with the other thing longer and it was heavier. She felt him go still beside her. Joy. I read the translation. I know what I signed. Her voice held. She'd decided it would. Tell me it isn't what I think. The rain moved through the walls around them. Somewhere above, footsteps crossed the second floor. I needed insulation for the assets, he said finally. Quiet. No performance in it. A civilian nominee. Clean hands on the legal holdings. You were available. And temporary. And now? The silence had weight. I needed a shield, Yuxuan said. But you became my heart. A pause. That wasn't the arrangement. I understand if it changes nothing. Joy stood in the dark with the river smell around them and the siege happening above them and the man who had lied to her telling the truth for possibly the first time since a rooftop in Gangnam. It doesn't change nothing, she said. She moved forward into the passage. Come on. I know the way out. Wow, you've hung in through the dark tunnels and betrayals, huge thanks for riding this far. With Min-jun waiting, subscribe and hit the bell for the explosive finish. Comment Team Joy below and share with your Mafia romance crew. The atrium panel opened behind Min-jun. He didn't hear it. That was the thing about men who had always owned every room they walked into. They stopped listening for what the room might do back. Yuxuan came through first. Joy followed. Min-jun turned. For one clean second, the three of them held the geometry of the thing, rain still audible through the damaged roof, one of the atrium's overhead lights swinging on a severed mount, throwing the space in and out of shadow. Lieutenant Kong lay against the far wall, permanently still, dealt with in the passage between the east wing and here, in a manner Joy had not looked at directly and had filed away for later. There was no later large enough for some things. She understood that now. Min-jun raised the gun with the smile of a man who had been waiting to be the last one standing. There it is, he said. The fraud and his prop. His eyes moved to Joy with the specific contempt of someone who had never once revised their original assessment of another person. Did he tell you what you are? A name on a document. A civilian face on a criminal empire. You're not his wife. You're a filing system. The swing of the overhead light. The rain. Joy stepped forward. Not because she wasn't afraid. She had stopped waiting to not be afraid sometime around day 4 in this building. She stepped forward because she knew the structure of this moment, she'd read it, the way she read all structures, and she knew where it was weak. It's not fake, she said. I own this house. I own the accounts your family has been laundering through the Shin Group's third-party holdings for the past 6 years. I own the debt, 430 million won, compounded. She held his eyes. I am his wife. And you are standing in my atrium. Min-jun's attention moved to her completely. Which was the point? Yuxuan closed the distance in 2 steps, and the gun hit the floor, and Min-jun hit the wall, and it was over with the same quiet efficiency as everything else in this man's life. No excess, no noise, just the application of force to a problem that had been building for 11 months and was now, definitively, finished. Dawn arrived without drama. It always did. The estate was damaged, 2 doors, the east wing, most of the ground floor communications. Reparable. Structures were always reparable if the foundation held. Yuxuan found her on the balcony as the city shifted from dark to gray to the first honest light. He stood beside her and after a long moment placed a folder on the railing between them. Annulment paperwork, he said. Prepared this morning. You sign and the assets revert. You walk out with a settlement and a clean record and no further involvement in any of this. Joy looked at the folder. Looked at his hands on the railing beside it, the tattoo running across his knuckles, the Korean script she could read now, had learned quietly over weeks the way she learned everything, because knowing the language of a place meant you could never pretend it hadn't changed you. Loyalty. Endurance. The city remembers. She put her hand over his. I didn't come this far, she said, to leave before I've finished reading the building. He turned to look at her. Below them, Seoul was doing what it always did, indifferent, glittering, vast, and entirely unconcerned with the 2 people on the balcony of a brutalist concrete mansion in Hannam-dong who had begun as a contract and become, in the way of all things built to last, something structural. Yuxuan turned his hand over beneath hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The city held them both, and the dawn came up over it like a verdict neither of them was running from anymore. The end.